I pray that you would be blessed by this evening and that God would speak to you through his word. We're going to be picking up again tonight, still in Ezekiel, still in chapter 28, and we're going to be picking it up at verse 11. That's chapter 28 and verse 11. And if you remember last time, we finished off with the king of Tyre thinking that he was a god, and God telling him that he was going to bring people against him, that he was going to die the death of the uncircumcised, or as it was translated by somebody, die like a dog. And it ended by God saying once again, I have spoken, I the Lord have spoken. So I'm going to read now verses 11 to 19. It's quite a long one, so please bear with me. Okay, the word of the Lord came to me. Son of man, take up a lament concerning the king of Tyre, and say to him, this is what the sovereign Lord says. You were the model of perfection, full of wisdom and perfect in beauty. You were in Eden, the garden of God. Every precious stone adorned you, ruby, topaz, and emerald, chrysolite, onyx, jasper, sapphire, turquoise, and beryl. Your settings and mountains were made of gold. On the day you were created, they were prepared. You were anointed as a guardian cherub, for so I ordained you. You were on the holy mount of God. You walked among the fiery stones. You were blameless in your ways from the day you were created till wickedness was found in you. Through your widespread trade, you were filled with violence, and you sinned. So I drove you in disgrace from the mount of God, and I expelled you, O guardian cherub, from among the fiery stones. Your heart became proud on account of your beauty, and you corrupted your wisdom because of your splendor. So I threw you to the earth. I made a spectacle of you before kings. By your many sins and dishonest trade, you have desecrated your sanctuaries. So I made a fire come out from you, and it consumed you. And I reduced you to ashes on the ground in the sight of all who were watching. All the nations who knew you were appalled at you. You have come to a horrible end and will be no more. Okay. Now, for those of you who don't already know, this is probably one of the most difficult passages to interpret, not only in the book of Ezekiel, but probably in the whole Bible. And the reason for this difficulty lies mainly in the lack of sufficient evidence to reach a precise conclusion. Now, there are many terms. Firstly, there are many terms and phrases that are only used in these verses in the Bible. And that complicates things a little bit because we've got no other references to go by to try and get what the people mean as we interpret this verse. But it's also confusing because it seems to be talking about two different people. Ezekiel is told specifically to take up a lament against the king of Tyre. But when you read things like, you were in Eden, the garden of God, or you were anointed on the holy mount of God, or you were anointed as a guardian cherub, there is no way that that is talking about the king of Tyre. These descriptions go well beyond anything any earthly king could claim to be. So there must be more to this than Ezekiel simply speaking about the king of Tyre. Now, over the years, the experts, we'll call them, have developed three particular theories concerning the interpretation of this chapter. In the first interpretation, some commentators are suggesting that this passage is simply a reference to the human king of Tyre. In this view, this whole passage should be interpreted as mocking the foolish thinking of the king, if you like, ridiculing his delusions of grandeur in thinking that he's a god. Now, one of the objections that you can raise against that way of thinking is the reference to a guardian cherub who walked about in Eden, the garden of God. Even if this passage speaks about the human king of Tyre, human beings are never called cherubim, which are angelic beings. So that's the problem with the first interpretation. The second interpretation comes from other ancient commentaries, such as the Jewish Talmud and the Targumim. In these commentaries, they say this passage alludes to the fall of the king, linking it metaphorically to the fall of Adam in the Garden of Eden. Now, the king of Tyre was not regarded as literally being in the Garden of Eden, but he was provided with all the luxuries equal to those that were in the paradise Garden of Eden. But there's a problem with this interpretation also. Just as with the first interpretation, this explanation fails to account for the difference between man and cherub. Also, in contrast to the cherub that's mentioned here in verse 28, Adam was never adorned with precious stones and gold from head to feet on the day he was created. Adam was created naked, and he was not ashamed of this at all, right up until the time they sinned. So it would be difficult to see how he could be called a guardian cherub, much less be anointed with all these jewels and walk amongst the fires of stone. Now, the third interpretation is one that is held by the Bible commentators Tertullian and Origen. And it's this, that these verses 11 to 19 speak about the fall of the king of Tyre and then liken his fall to the fall of Satan and Satan's power at work in the human king. In this view, just as Satan in his unfallen state was placed in Eden, in the garden of God, and is called the anointed guardian cherub, who is perfect, beautiful, completely adorned with precious stones and gold, and who walked in the middle of the stones of fire. So the human king of Tyre is placed he's in a place of similar authority. He's in his own Garden of Eden, his own little paradise with his own riches. And this cherub Satan fell because of his pride and will face judgment by fire because of it. And so this human king of Tyre also is going to fall because of his pride. Now, I tend personally to agree with the third interpretation, that it compares the king of Tyre to the fall of Satan. If you read these verses carefully and think about them, part of them obviously refer to a human king, but then part of them can in no way be attributed to a human king. And so I tend to go with the third interpretation, that this is comparing the king of Tyre to the fall of Satan. And this third one seems to be the interpretation that most of the Bible scholars go along with. And interpretations 1 and 2 seem to be in a minority view. So take verses 12 to 15. They describe a being of some beauty, adorned with gold and precious jewels, a being that was in the Garden of Eden, appointed as a guardian cherub. Now, before his fall, Satan was indeed a beautiful creature. Now, if your interpretation of Satan, if the picture you've got in your head is someone wearing a red suit, holding a pitchfork and having a forked tail, or some evil, sinister-looking creature with pointed ears and a goatee, then you're wide of the mark. Because we know that Satan was a being of some beauty in the Garden of Eden. And if you read 2 Corinthians chapter 11, it reads, "And no wonder, for Satan himself masquerades as an angel of light." So I would ask you, bearing in mind what I've just said, how can somebody with pointed ears, a goatee and a pitchfork masquerade as an angel of light? Satan was indeed most beautiful and powerful of all the angels. But rather than give God the glory for creating him so, Satan took pride in himself, thinking that he was responsible for this beauty and his status. And that pride that developed led to his fall. And so the king of Tyre, in the same vein, has elevated himself to a position of a god. He thought of himself higher than he really was. And this is going to lead to his downfall. That is his bit of pride. And you know, the idea of a prophet speaking against a spiritual ruler or authority behind an earthly king is not a new one. It's mentioned in Isaiah chapter 14, where the description of the king of Babylon seems to go beyond anything any earthly king could claim to be. And we also see it in Daniel chapter 10, where the angel Michael described his battle with a spiritual opponent he called the Prince of Persia. So this is not a new thing, this prophets talking and comparing about the spiritual work of Satan behind an earthly ruler on earth. And I guess if we're honest, we've seen the same thing in the last 100 years or so. You know, Satan working through earthly people in places of authority. And so this human king of Tyre, like Satan, was prideful, and rather than recognize God's sovereignty, he attributed all the wealth he's built up, all the power of these cities, to his own wisdom and strength. And not satisfied with his already extravagant position, he sought more and more, resulting in Tyre as a nation taking advantage of the nations around him, gathering the wealth at the other nations' expenses. Verse 17 tells us that because of his pride and corruption, God threw Satan to the earth and made a spectacle of him before kings. And just as Satan's pride led to his fall and will eventually lead to his destruction, so the city of Tyre will lose its wealth, power, and status. Just as Satan was made a spectacle of before kings, so the king of Tyre will be made a spectacle of before kings. God will not be mocked, eh? Okay, I'm just going to read verses 8. Excuse me. Yeah, that's right.
So something must have happened for Lucifer not to have got the other 3 stones.
Yeah.
And it was at that point that he was thrown from heaven.
Yeah.
And as it says then later on, that the reason for his fall. But I didn't know those other 2 interpretations that you said. The logical one was that it was linked to the king of Tyre, that his fall because he was satanic.
Yeah.
Linked to that.
Yeah, I suppose. Absolutely, yeah. I suppose you could say that anything that goes against God's people right throughout the ages is probably that Satan's had his hand in it somewhere along the line, trying to destroy God's plan and God's people. Okay, verses 18 and 19. I've read them once. I'll read them again just to refresh your memory. By your many sins and dishonest trade, you have desecrated your sanctuaries. So I made a fire come out from you, and it consumed you, and I reduced you to ashes on the ground in the sight of all who were watching. All the nations who knew you were appalled at you. You have come to a horrible end and will be no more. Oh, I'm getting ahead of myself now. I do get carried away. Yeah. Okay. These two verses are as difficult to interpret as the rest of the chapter, in a way. By your many sins you have desecrated your sanctuaries. Now this, if you think about it, could just as easily be applied to a person as to a city, or the whole population of a city, or it could be talking about both of them. Going along with the idea this chapter compares the king of Tyre to Satan, the commentator David Guzik says this: the reference to trade in verse 16 shows that there is a blend of the king of Tyre and his master. The king traded for his own power, Satan sold his glory for violent rebellion. Tyre was a highly commercialized city-state focused only on winning a profit. Satan's abundance of trading was found in his competitive spirit, his desire to be exalted above all his associates. So the focus on winning profit corrupted and eventually ruined ancient Tyre, just as the focus of winning glory and honor has corrupted Satan and will bring his end. And the Reverend George Morgan, who incidentally is a British-based evangelist and Bible teacher, says this: this connection between Tyre and Satan shows that the devil can be in business just as much as in armies and war. Tyre's strength and influence were commercial rather than military. And it's interesting and suggestive that in this connection we find the most graphic and illuminating portrayal to be found in the whole Bible. Probably nowhere else will you find any description of Satan than a better one than what goes on here. Now this passage also talks about sanctuaries. Now again, there's a few translations of this. It seems to depend upon who translated it and where. A lot of translations use the word sanctuaries, but some translations use the words places of worship. And some even use the words holy places. So we've got three different alternatives to this description: you have desecrated your sanctuaries. We're reading, no, you've desecrated your sanctuaries, or you've desecrated your places of worship, or you've desecrated your holy places.